The idea or concept of injecting a middleman between an existing Radius client and a Radius server is known as a Radius proxy. In this nugget, I'd like to chat with you about a few reasons why we would want to do this, and then secondly, I'll walk you through how to do it. Now, we've discussed the benefit of using a Radius server as a centralized clearinghouse for authentication. So if we have Radius clients, for example, a VPN gateway, or a wireless access point, or a wireless LAN controller, or an 802.1x switch, instead of configuring each of those devices to do the authentication themselves, we can refer them to one or more Radius servers as a member of a group that can then handle the authentication and then just give those access servers the results, like yes, 2 thumbs up or 2 thumbs down, regarding whether or not the client who's trying to get access should be given access or not. Well, these 2 Radius servers, what if they're not both Microsoft servers? Maybe one's from Microsoft and the other is from Cisco or some other vendor. And perhaps one of the Radius servers can handle specific attributes while the other can't. The reason that can get a little bit tricky is that when we are setting up a wireless access point or a VPN gateway or an 802.1x switch as a Radius client, we'd have to know ahead of time, okay, which Radius server or which Radius group do we use? Another challenge is that if we tell a Radius client that there's multiple servers in a Radius group, we're leaving it up to the client to do appropriate load balancing based on the priorities and the weights of those servers in that group to help manage the load distribution regarding those 2 Radius servers. Also, if we have physical or logical firewalls between the access servers, the Radius clients, and the Radius servers, we need to make sure we punch the appropriate holes in those firewalls so they can go ahead and communicate. Which also means that if we add another Radius server down here, let's call this Radius 3, and we intend for these servers to go ahead and use that 3rd Radius server, we have to punch appropriate holes from each of their source IP addresses to that new IP address of the Radius server. Now, a solution that can assist with each of those scenarios is Radius proxies. We'll call this guy Radius proxy A on the left and Radius proxy B on the right. And then what we could do is we could train our Radius clients that they're supposed to use these proxies. So what we're doing when we're setting up these relationships between the Radius clients and these proxies is we're telling these Radius clients that these Radius proxies are actually Radius servers as part of the Radius server group. And we want to whisper a little bit on that one because these Radius clients, all they know is that they're pointing to an IP address who's supposed to be a Radius server, and that's all they know. And then once we have that done, we can set up another set of relationships between the proxies and the real Radius servers themselves. From the Radius server perspective, these proxies just look like 2 Radius clients. So the big picture is that the real Radius clients think the Radius proxies are servers, and the real Radius servers think that the proxies are real Radius clients. And that addresses some of the concerns we talked about earlier, including firewall rules. For example, if we added a 4th or a 5th Radius server, we wouldn't have to change any of the firewall rules between the Radius clients and the proxies, because that part didn't change, just the back end did. Another benefit is we could have the Radius proxies in charge of load balancing. So when they get requests, they could be in charge of doing the appropriate load balancing against the back-end Radius servers. And if there were specific types of requests that were coming in from one of our Radius clients that needed to go to a specific Radius server or a different Radius server group, the Radius proxy could go ahead and look at the attributes and then make that correct forwarding decision to the right Radius server based on the type of request that's coming in. And the benefit is we can hide all that detail from the Radius clients and just point them to the 2 proxies, then have the 2 proxies do all that work for us. So in the lab environment, let's talk about what we currently have and then how we'll modify that to insert a proxy in between server 2, the Radius client, and DCNUG, the current Radius server. So currently when the PC builds a VPN connection to server 2 has a connection request policy saying to use the Radius server, which causes server 2 to forward that request over to DCNUG, who does the authentication and authorization for the VPN, and then sends that message back to server 2, who gives the client access. So what we'll do is we'll modify this scenario, and we'll have server 2 still as a Radius client, but we'll train him to use server 3 as a Radius proxy. And vice versa. We'll train server 3 that it's got a Radius client of server 2. Because from the perspective of client-server, that's the relationship. Server 2 is going to be the client, and the proxy is going to be acting as a Radius server. And then on the back end, we'll configure server 3 as a client who's making a request over to DCNUG, and vice versa. We'll configure DCNUG and tell it that it has server 3 as a Radius client. And on the connection request policy for server 3, we'll identify that any requests that come in it should forward them over to DCNUG. And let me go ahead and put the IP addresses of these three on as well so we can see those. DCNUG is on the 192.168.1 network at the IP address with IPv4 of .100. Server 2 is .102, and server 3 is at .103. So effectively, we're just adding the middleman of server 3 as the proxy between the existing server 2 client and the existing DCNUG Radius server. So let's begin our work here at the Radius server itself, which is DCNUG. So here at DCNUG, let's go ahead and launch Server Manager. And here in Server Manager, we'll click on Tools, and from the menu, we'll select Network Policy Server. Now here in Network Policy Server, if we take a look at our Radius clients, by expanding Radius clients and servers and clicking on Radius clients, we have one. Currently, our only client we're expecting to talk with is server 2. Now, what we could do is we could just edit that and say, instead of listening to server 2, we're going to go ahead and expect our client to be the proxy. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and double click on server 2, and let's modify the properties to say, instead of it being at .102, it's going to be at 103, which is the IP address of server 3. And click on OK. And you know what? Let's go back in and rename this too, because the friendly name is still server 2 VPN gateway, and that might be confusing if we look at that later. So let's go ahead and call this our proxy server 3 and click on OK. Fantastic. Our Radius server is now done. It's just now expecting to hear from a different Radius client. Next, let's make a road trip over to our proxy, which is server 3, and configure it. And here on server 3 in the lab, we'll go ahead and launch Server Manager as well. Now on this server, I've already taken the liberty of installing the Network Policy and Access Service on server 3. So that's all ready to go. And so to launch the Network Policy Manager, we'll go to Tools in Server Manager, and from the drop-down, select Network Policy Server. On server 3, we need to do a couple of things. Number one, we need to tell it that we have a client, which is server 2, the VPN gateway, and we also need to tell this proxy about the real Radius server, which is DCNUG. So we're going to expand the Radius clients and server section, and we need to configure both sides, the client pointing at server 2 and the server pointing at DCNUG. So let's go ahead and do the client first. We'll click on Radius Clients, right click, and from the drop-down select New. For the friendly name, we'll call it the VPN gateway. The IP address of server 2 is 192.168.1.102. We'll go ahead and put our password in, our shared secret, so we can communicate via Radius with that client. And with that supplied, we'll also confirm it by typing that in again. And if we were connecting to another vendor who had specific attributes for Radius, if we go to the Advanced tab, from the drop-down, we have a nice laundry list that could be helpful in making sure that the attributes match up with the vendor's implementation of Radius that we're connecting to. So we're just going to leave the Radius standard setting, go back to Settings, confirm our details, and click on OK. So now, from a proxy perspective, we know of one client, which is server 2. Next, let's go ahead and configure at least one server in a server group. We'll click on Remote Radius Server Groups. There's none present yet. We'll right-click. We'll select New from the drop-down. And let's call this group Group with DC-Nug in it. And it'll be very clear when we see it in the config what this group contains. And we'll add DCNUG as the sole server in that group. So we'll click on Add. We'll put in the server's IP address of 192.168.1.100, which is the IPv4 address for DC-Nug. Then we'll click on the Authentication and Accounting tab. We'll use the default ports. We'll put in the shared secret, and we'll confirm the shared secret. And then the load balancing tab, it doesn't matter too much what we put here because we only have one server in this Radius group. So we'll go ahead and click on OK and OK again. And now we have a single Radius servers group with DCNUG in it. And there's one little piece to the puzzle that we still need to solve. If server 2, as it has its requests, send those requests to server 3, the proxy, we need to make sure that server 3 knows to forward those requests onto DC-Nug, the real Radius server. So we've got the client identified, we have the server identified, and now we need to go to the connection request policies to train this proxy server that if it does get requests, who to go ahead and forward them to. And this is where we could get really granular with various types of requests that come in, and based on the conditions that are matched, being forwarded to specific Radius server groups. And for our example, let's take this default connection request policy that's in place here on our proxy server. This is server 3. We'll double click on it to edit it. And basically it's wide open. It's not looking for any specific type of network access server. The policy is enabled. If we click on conditions, and the only condition that we have listed here is that it has to come in on some day of the week, any day, at any time. So basically it's wide open as far as a match. And then if we go to settings, and it's here under settings that we could specify that we want to forward this authentication request over to a specific Radius server group. And in doing this, it's virtually identical to what we did on the Radius client in our previous nugget. And that is, under settings, we'd go to authentication. We'd click on the radio button saying, I want to forward this request to the following remote Radius server group. And then from the drop down, select the group. Or if you don't have a group yet created, we can click on the new button right here, create the group, put the server in it, and then select it. So with that in place, we'll go ahead and click on OK. And you know what? We should probably rename that as well. So let's go ahead and double click on that connection request policy. And let's call this policy forward to Radius server. And that way when we see this, we'll remember what it's actually doing. So we'll go ahead and click on OK. And that looks better. So our next piece of the puzzle is to go to the VPN gateway server 2 and tell it that instead of pointing to DCNUG and that Radius server group for authentication, it should instead point to the proxy. So let's make a road trip over to server 2. So here at server 2, we need to change the connection request policy and point to a server group that our proxy is in instead of a Radius server group where DCNUG is in. So to do that, we'll click on Tools, and from the drop down, we'll click on Network Policy Server here on server 2. And we have a few options here. We could create a new Radius server group that contains our proxy server, server 3, or we could edit the existing Radius server group and just point to server 3 as the proxy instead of pointing to DCNUG. And that would probably be the most direct way of doing it, actually. So let's expand Radius clients and servers, and we'll go ahead and click on the remote Radius server groups, and we'll just double click on our Radius server group to edit it. And let's just modify the name to our Radius proxy group, and we'll also go ahead and double click on the single entry there, which is .100, which is DCNUG, and change that to .103, which is the IP address for server 3, who's our proxy. So we'll click on OK, click on OK. So to confirm that we're all set, if we go to policies and double click on connection request policies, and we edit our connection request policy and take a look at the details, under settings and authentication, we're going to be forwarding a request to the following remote Radius group, our Radius proxy group, which contains our single proxy server, which is server 3. So we'll go ahead and click on OK. So now with our current configuration, what should happen is the client should build a VPN tunnel to server 2. Server 2 will use the services of server 3, the proxy server, regarding the authentication. And server 3 as the proxy will forward that request over to DCNUG, who will process that. And then for the response is going to go from DCNUG back to the proxy, and then from the proxy to the Radius client, which is server 2. And assuming that it all went well, it'll be 2 thumbs up, and the client will get its VPN connection. And before we test that, since we're right here on server 2, if we click on the Windows icon and just type in Wireshark, W-I-R-E-S-H-A-R-K, and then go ahead and just click on Wireshark to run it, if we capture the traffic, we should see the Radius communication, but this time it should happen between server 2, which is at .102, and server 3, the proxy, at .103. So let me go ahead and minimize the network policy server and minimize server manager. And let's click on the Wireshark icon just to bring it up. And what we want to do is we want to capture traffic on the inside interface. So we'll double click on the interface named inside, and that'll start the capture. And if we want, we can put a Radius display filter in place right now, just by clicking our mouse in the upper left here in the display filter area and typing in RADIUS and pressing enter. And with that display filter in place, the only traffic that'll come to the surface here in the output will be Radius traffic. So let's go to our client and test our connection. So here at our client computer, let's go ahead and right click on the Windows icon bottom left hand corner and select Network Connections. Let's go ahead and select Inside 192, right click on that interface and select Disable from the drop down. And that way we have one active interface on the outside, and then we can use one of our VPN connections to build the tunnel over to server 2. So we'll go ahead and click on any one of our VPN entries here, and then we'll go ahead and let's select IPv4 L2TP-IPsec and click on Connect. Oh my gosh. I was expecting at least one parameter to be off somewhere in that chain between the client, server 2, the proxy, and DCNUG, but by golly, it just worked, and I'll take it. And let's go back to our packet capture that's still running on server 2. So back at server 2, we'll go ahead and click on the stop icon to stop the packet capture. And let's bring that packet capture full screen. So if we grab any one of these, let's grab a request here. And sure enough, it's coming from the source address of .102, which is server 2's last octet, last portion of its IPv4 address, going to .103. And if we'd done another capture up on DCNUG, which you're welcome to do in the lab, by the way, we would see a whole bunch of radius traffic between .103, our proxy's address, and .100, the radius server. In this nugget, we've walked through the concept and the implementation of putting a middleman, a radius proxy, between the radius client and the real radius server. And I would encourage you to reinforce what we've learned in this nugget by practicing in the hands-on labs that we've provided for you as part of your subscription to CBT Nuggets. So have some fun with the lab, and I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.